I keep thinking about the questions I never asked. Not because asking them would have changed anything. I don't think it would have. But because questioning things is literally what I do for a living. And somehow, in that moment, I hadn't asked a single question that actually mattered. The call came in late October. Wednesday, I think. The woman on the line introduced herself as being from the Site Coordination Office in Ankara. Her English was clear, almost too clear. No pauses, no searching for words. She spoke like she had said the same thing many times before. She told me the epigrapher assigned to the Catalhoyuk excavation had stepped down due to a health issue. Then she said my name had been recommended as a replacement. Just like that, according to her, the team needed someone experienced in Neolithic symbolic systems. She mentioned my publications, briefly, like she had skimmed them, and said I was a strong match. The position would start in 10 days, if I was available. 10 days. She said everything in this calm, almost attached tone, like she was rearranging a schedule, not replacing a person. And I said yes. I didn't ask what kind of health issue forced someone to leave mid-season. I didn't ask who had recommended me. I didn't even question why they needed someone that urgently. 10 days instead of waiting for the next proper field cycle, which would have made far more sense. But I didn't think twice about it. I had spent 11 years at Durham. I had enough published work in pre-Neolithic Anatolian systems to make the offer feel normal, expected even. It was the kind of opportunity one would have applied for myself. So I accepted. I wrote down the details. Flights, contact names, equipment requirements, and then I started packing. That's the part one keep coming back to, because if I'm honest, the story didn't start when I arrived at the site. It started right there. I just didn't realize it yet. The flight into Konya in early November always feels the same, flat, open, exposed. Like there's nothing in the landscape willing to hide you. The sky hangs low, heavy and gray, pressing down on everything beneath it. The land stretches out in this pale, endless expanse that feels older than it should. I'd worked in Turkey before. A survey near Göbekli Tepe in 2017. Some documentation work outside Ankara before that. But the Central Plateau, it's different. There's something about it that feels unfinished. Or maybe too finished. The two mounds at Catalhoyuk don't stand out the way you'd expect. Not at first. They don't rise dramatically from the earth. They just exist, low, quiet shapes against the horizon. But once you notice them, it's hard to look anywhere else. Like they've been there longer than the land around them, which, in a way, they have. The drive from Konya took just under an hour. The driver introduced himself as Mehmet, though he said it quickly, like he didn't expect me to repeat it. He didn't talk much after that. Just one question. Had I been to the site before? I told him no. He nodded once and kept driving. The mounds appeared sooner than I expected, off to the right side of the road. Not impressive, not cinematic. Just two uneven rises breaking the flatness, with the excavation shelters standing over them like dark frames. I already had my field jacket on. My bag rested between my feet. And I was thinking about work, the level 12 eastern sections, the painted plaster, the UV documentation I've been briefed on. That's all I was thinking about. Work. The accommodation block was exactly what you'd expect from a long-running field site. Prefabricated. Functional. No effort wasted on comfort. Narrow hallways. Identical doors. Each one with a plastic name holder fixed at eye level. At the end of the corridor, a shared kitchen that carried a permanent smell of instant coffee and something cooked days ago that never quite faded. The site coordinator, Berna, met me near the entrance. She looked exhausted in a way that suggested it wasn't temporary, like she'd been running things alone for too long. She walked me down the corridor, pointed at a door, third on the left, and said that was mine. My name was already there, printed on a small slip of paper, slightly crooked. I dropped my bag inside, took a quick look around. Single bed, small desk, shelf above it, a narrow window facing the mound, and then went back out. No point settling in yet. I wanted to meet the others. There were 4 people on site that week. 5, technically, but one of them, Lloyd, I hadn't met yet. Peter was a geophysics postdoc from Utrecht, spoke fast, ate faster. 2 excavation specialists from Istanbul whose names I got wrong more than once before finally getting them right. And Sandra, the finds coordinator from Edinburgh. She'd been there for 3 seasons. Sandra gave me a look the moment we met. Not unfriendly, just measured. The kind of look that says she's seen people come and go, and she's learned not to get attached too quickly. Fair enough. At some point, I asked about Garrett, the person I was replacing. It felt like a reasonable question. I asked if he'd left any notes. A working catalog. Anything I could use to pick up where he left off. Sandra paused, then set her mug down. There wasn't much, she said. He wasn't here long. How long? I asked. She thought about it. 3 weeks, maybe less. He got sick. It happened quickly. I said something polite, something automatic, and asked if his materials had been archived anywhere accessible. She said she didn't think so, and that was it. The conversation moved on, and I let it. It was 2 days later when I noticed something wasn't right, not because I was looking for it. I was just trying to find the linen cupboard. Berna had mentioned it was at the far end of the corridor, past the last room. So I walked the full length, glancing at the name cards as I went. Just a habit, mapping the space in my head. Peter Vanderberg, Sandra Hall, Kemal Arslan, Denise Yildiz. Then mine, 5 names, 5 occupied rooms. But there were 8 doors. I stopped at the end of the hallway and counted again, then walked back. 3 doors had empty holders. One of them stood out. There was a faint rectangular mark on the paint, slightly brighter than the rest of the door, the exact shape of a name card, like something had been removed recently. I opened it. The room was wrong, not messy, not abandoned, clean, too clean. The bed was stripped completely, just a bare mattress. No sheets, no creases. The surface was perfectly flat. No sign that anyone had slept there recently. No indentation. Nowhere. The desk was empty. The shelves wiped down. There wasn't a single personal item. Not even something small. No charger. No notebook. Nothing forgotten. Nothing left behind. Not even the kind of absence you expect. It didn't feel like someone had lived there for 3 weeks. It felt like no one had ever been assigned to it all. I closed the door. Went to the linen cupboard. Stood there longer than I needed to. 3 weeks. That's what Sandra had said. 3 weeks is enough time to leave something behind. Everyone does. But there was nothing. So I did what I always do. I filed it away. Like an unfamiliar symbol you don't yet understand. You note it, categorize it, and move on until you have more context. It didn't fit the explanation I'd been given. But it wasn't enough to build anything from. Not yet. I had work to do, a survey to prepare, a team to settle into. So I said nothing. Looking back, that was the first thread I should have pulled. But I didn't. The first full briefing took place on Friday morning. Lloyd ran it. By then, I'd met him briefly. Dr. Lloyd Stanford. He introduced himself with his full title and a handshake that felt practiced. Firm, controlled, confident, the kind of presence that fills a room without effort. The meeting took place in the main site office, a larger prefab structure lined with maps, every wall covered. The table in the center was too small for the number of people around it. The discussion was routine. Excavation updates from the southern mound, geophysics reports from Peter, a review of the level 12 eastern sections, confirming I begin UV documentation the following Monday. I sat there, taking notes. The room smelled like coffee and damp canvas. Everything felt normal, until Quinn walked in, 8 minutes late. I hadn't been introduced to her yet. She walked in like she belonged there, not rushed, not hesitant, just certain. No apology for being late, no attempt to soften the interruption. She placed a clipboard down on the table and waited. Lloyd didn't stop speaking. He didn't even acknowledge her presence. She stood there for a few seconds, longer than most people would have been comfortable with. Then, without asking for permission, she spoke anyway. "I need to address a ministry requirement before we continue." Her voice was calm, precise, the kind of English that's technically perfect, but carries that slightly formal edge, like every sentence has been measured before it's spoken. Lloyd kept his eyes on the table for a moment, then slowly looked up at her. Not annoyed, not surprised, just assessing. "All personal electronic devices," she continued, "phones, tablets, recording equipment, must be registered with a ministry site log before entering any excavation chamber. This applies to every entry, effective immediately." There was a brief silence after she finished. Lloyd stared at her, the way you stare at a sound that hasn't stopped when it should have. "Gail," he said finally, "we've already discussed the registration protocols. The team is compliant." "The requirement has changed," she replied without hesitation. "Registration is now required before each entry, not at the start of the season. That's not practical. It's not optional." Another pause. Then Lloyd held her gaze for a second longer and looked away. "We'll deal with the logistics separately," he said, already turning back to the table. "Let's move on." And just like that, the moment passed. The briefing continued, and everyone let it. I wrote it down anyway. Device registration. Ministry. Quinn. Then I turned the page and went back to taking notes about the UV survey. And, for the time being, I forgot about it. 2 small details. Completely separate. Already pointing towards something I wasn't ready to understand. The eastern wall of level 12 had a smell to it. That's the first thing I remember. Not the symbols. Not the discovery. Just the smell. Chalk. Cold water. And something underneath both of them that I couldn't quite place. Something mineral. Old. The kind of scent that doesn't have a name because no one has ever needed to describe it before. I'd been assigned a plaster survey as routine documentation work. Nothing unusual about it. You photograph the wall in sections, log the condition of the plaster, note pigment decay, cracks, structural inconsistencies, move to the next section. I'd done it dozens of times. The UV lamp was just standard equipment. You pass it over the surface because sometimes pigments invisible to the naked eye show up under ultraviolet. Faded ochres, lime wash, traces of older work hidden beneath newer layers. Most of the time, you find nothing. Sometimes you find something minor, a border, a handprint, a pattern missed during the initial survey. Useful, but rarely significant. I was working the 3rd section from the north end, about 1.5 meters above the floor. My knees were already starting to ache from crouching. The UV lamp was in my left hand. The camera hung loosely around my neck. And I'd reached that point you always reach during repetitive work, where your hands keep moving, but your mind drifts somewhere else entirely. I wasn't focused, and that's probably why I saw it. The light caught something near the base of the wall, just above the floor line. At first, I thought it was pigment, but it wasn't on the surface. It was beneath it. A shape. No, not a shape. A pattern. It looked like a shadow, but sharper. Too defined to be accidental. I stopped moving the lamp, held it steady, leaned in closer, and that's when I saw the lines. Carved, not painted, not surface markings. Actual incisions, angular, clean, running in tight vertical columns. They started roughly 40 centimeters above the floor and extended straight down, all the way to the base. And then, that was the part that took a moment to register. They didn't stop there. The lines didn't end at the floor. They continued, through it, according to the site maps. There was nothing below that level. No chamber, no continuation, no structural void, just solid substrate, packed, undisturbed material. These carvings shouldn't have been able to exist there, and yet they did. I don't remember deciding to take the first photograph. I just did. Then another, then more, 12 in total, moving systematically across the section, because that's what you do. You document first. You think later. When you spend enough years working with Neolithic iconography, you develop a kind of internal reference system, a vocabulary, not just from one site, but across regions, across time. Catalhoyuk, Göbekli Tepe, Navali Kori, dozens of smaller sites that never made it into wider discussion. Patterns repeat, forms evolve, symbols migrate across centuries and distances. You learn them the way you learn the streets of a city you've lived in for years. You might not recognize every detail, but you always know when something doesn't belong. And these didn't belong. Not anywhere. The shapes were consistent, deliberate, not decorative, not random. They had structure, purpose, the kind of density you see in something functional, like writing or instruction. Each column was evenly spaced. Same width, same depth, 7 columns visible across the section. 7. I counted them twice. Whoever carved them knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't improvisation. This was planned. I spent another 40 minutes working along the base of the wall, trying to trace how far down the carvings extended. But I couldn't. The floor was solid, without breaking it open. There was no way to follow the lines further. So I documented everything I could, every angle, every variation in light. Then I packed up. I walked back to the accommodation block, without really thinking about the route. Went into my room, sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing my jacket, and stayed there for a while, not doing anything, just sitting. The next morning, I printed the photographs. I didn't want Lloyd seeing them on a screen he could minimize or dismiss too quickly. I wanted them in front of him, at full scale, impossible to ignore. His office was the largest room in the administrative section, which didn't say much. A desk, 2 chairs, a shelf lined with binders, a wall map of the excavation grid, marked with colored pins. He was already there when I knocked. Of course he was. Lloyd struck me as the kind of person who was always already in place, never arriving, never leaving, just present. At the time, I took it as discipline. Later, I started to think it might have been something else. Control. I laid the photographs out across his desk, 3 rows, left to right, showing the entire section, from the upper wall down to floor and the continuation beyond it. I explained everything, where I found them, how I found them. UV survey, lower wall, subsurface carvings extending into what should have been solid ground. I kept it clinical, precise, no speculation, just facts. I'd framed the images carefully, making sure the floor line was clearly visible in each shot, so he could see it, so he couldn't miss it. And then I waited for him to say something. Lloyd studied the photographs for a long time, but not in the way you expect when someone is seeing something new or surprising. There was no shift in posture, no leaning closer, no instinct to pick one up and examine it. He simply stood there, hands flat against the desk, looking down at them with a kind of stillness that didn't feel like curiosity. It felt like recognition, like he already knew what he was looking at and had hoped, quietly, that he wouldn't have to see it again. That's the only way I can describe it, and the silence stretched long enough that I started to feel the need to fill it. But I didn't, because after 11 years in academic environments, you learn to tell the difference between someone thinking and someone deciding, and Lloyd wasn't thinking. Eventually he spoke, his voice level, asking only, where exactly in the eastern wall, and I gave him precise location, 3rd section from the north, lower register, grid coordinates included. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, then said he'd have someone check the structural integrity of that section. And that was it. No follow-up questions, no request to keep the photographs, nothing, which told me more than anything he could have said. I gathered the prints myself and left, stepping out into the corridor where the cold always seemed to linger no matter the time of day. And I stood there for a moment without really forming a clear thought, just aware that something about his reaction, or lack of, it didn't sit right. The next morning during the briefing, he announced, in that same flat, unquestioned tone he used for everything, that the eastern wall section of level 12 was now closed due to structural concerns, and access was suspended until further notice. No one challenged it. No one even asked a question. The authority in his voice made sure of that. He mentioned a safety survey would be arranged once the engineering team confirmed availability. And that was the end of it, except a week passed and nothing happened. No survey, no engineers, no change. I asked casually around the site. First one assistant, then another a few days later. Both said they hadn't heard anything. And that's when it shifted in my mind, because this wasn't delay, it wasn't caution, it was suppression. And I don't use that word lightly. Suppression only makes sense if you already understand what you're suppressing. Curiosity doesn't seal off a section of wall. Uncertainty doesn't either. What does is recognition. The kind Lloyd had shown when he looked at those photographs, that quiet, unmoving acknowledgement of something familiar and unwelcome. I still had images, printed and digital copies both. He hadn't asked for them, hadn't told me to delete them. Maybe he assumed I would, or maybe he thought sealing the site would be enough. But the symbols were still there, running beneath the level 12 floor into something that shouldn't exist. And whatever was down there hadn't changed just because access had been restricted. I knew I was going back before I consciously admitted it. The idea had already settled somewhere in the back of my mind while I stood outside his office. It just took me a few days to stop pretending otherwise. Thursday evening made the most sense. I noticed a pattern without realizing I was paying attention. The site always quieted earlier that day, no obvious reason, just one of those rhythms places develop over time. I spent 3 days watching, confirming it, mapping out who went where and when. By 7, the pathways were empty, the lights in the western trenches shut off, and Quinn usually stayed occupied in the storage annex long, enough that she wouldn't cross paths with anyone. I told myself I was being careful, but really I was just buying time to get past the hesitation. I went at 7:30 with a headlamp, UV lamp, my notebook, and my phone. The notebook felt like habit, but it was more than that. After seeing Lloyd's reaction, I didn't trust relying on anything that could fail without explanation. The barrier was still there when I reached the eastern passage. A simple wooden frame with yellow notice taped. Across it, Lloyd's signature at the bottom. Structural assessment pending. I stood there briefly, looking at it, then ducked underneath without thinking twice. The UV light revealed the carvings immediately, sharp and unchanged, exactly where I'd left them, and something in my chest eased slightly at the confirmation I had imagined it. They were real. I crouched lower this time, angling the light into the seam where the wall met the floor, and that's when I saw it, not a crack, not damage, but a gap roughly 40 centimeters across, as if the floor had never been fully sealed, and the carvings continued straight through into darkness below. I lay flat on the ground, pressing my headlamp toward the opening, and saw the edge of a chamber beneath, about 1.5 meters down. The moment didn't feel dramatic the way you'd expect. It just felt final, like something that had already been decided long before I arrived. There were handholds carved into the edge, worn smooth from use, and I noticed them without letting myself think too much about what that implied. Because once you start asking who made them and how often they've been used, you can't stop. So I climbed down, estimating later it was around 4 meters, which would place the space somewhere far older than the Neolithic layer above. Older by a margin that stops feeling theoretical once you're standing inside it. The chamber itself was irregular, maybe 8 meters across, the ceiling dipping lower toward the far wall, and every surface, every inch within reach of the light, was covered in the same angular carvings, but denser, more complex, not just vertical columns, but intersecting lines, curved paths, overlapping sequences that felt structured but unreadable. I turned slowly in place, trying to find a section untouched and failing. It was everywhere. I wrote Chamber 7 North in my notebook, giving a label because that's what training teaches you to do when nothing else applies. At the center was a raised stone platform, roughly knee height, its surface smoothed deliberately, and carved into it were 2 shallow grooves, parallel curved, each about the width of a wrist, not cut sharply but worn down over time in a way that suggested repeated contact. I tested it without thinking, placing my wrist into one of them. It fit too. Well, and I pulled away almost immediately, focusing instead on recording measurements, spacing, anything that grounded the moment in data. And that's when I felt it, not exactly a sound, more like a vibration, something low and rhythmic that registered in the chest before the ears. I stood still and waited. It came again for distinct beats, evenly spaced and silence. I counted the gap, 11 seconds, then the pattern repeated for beats, 11 seconds, consistent enough that I followed it to a narrow fissure in the rock at the far end of the chamber, a vertical crack running from floor to ceiling. I held my hand near it but felt nothing. No airflow, no temperature change, just a steady pulse coming from somewhere deeper, too regular to be natural, too precise to dismiss. I've spent enough time around geological formations to know their sounds. This wasn't any of them. I took out my phone and started recording, watching the timer as it reached 17 seconds. Then the screen went black, completely unresponsive. The battery had been at 64% when I came down. I had checked. And 64% doesn't just vanish like that, not in seconds, not without cause. I stood there in the dim light with a dead phone and the sound continuing beneath me, steady and unchanging, and forced myself to stay focused. I used a UV lamp to capture what images I could, holding it close enough to illuminate the carvings while taking photographs without proper lighting. Not ideal, but better than nothing. I filled 6 full pages of my notebook, sketches, symbol patterns, measurements, notes on the grooves, the fissure, the exact interval of the pulse. I wrote 11 seconds in the margin and circled it 3 times so I wouldn't forget how certain I was. And when I had everything I could reasonably take, I climbed back up, pulled myself through the gap, slipped under the barrier, and crossed the silent site back toward the accommodation block. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time, turning the dead phone over my hands, while everything else stayed exactly where I dropped it, the UV lamp dim on the floor, the notebook open across my knee, pages filled with notes that didn't feel theoretical anymore. I had just come back from a space that officially didn't exist, buried beneath a layer that, if I was honest about the depth, pushed the timeline of human presence here far beyond anything accepted. The walls down there were covered in symbols I couldn't place in any known system. The central platform showed signs of repeated use by something with human proportions. And beneath it all, inside the rock itself, something was still pulsing at perfectly spaced 11-second intervals, steady enough to measure time against, and whatever it was that drained my phone from more than half charged to nothing in seconds. I pressed the power button again out of habit, but the screen stayed black, and the thought settled in, quietly, that whatever I found wasn't dormant. It was active in some way I didn't understand. The following week, I tried to approach it like I would any other academic problem, which is to say I tried to pretend this was still normal work. I had the images saved, I had my notes, and I had access to the site's research system, a shared database used to cross-check findings against existing records from Catalhoyuk and beyond, years of catalog material, plus extended access to broader archaeological archives. It should have been enough to at least give me a direction. I started simple, isolating individual shapes in the carvings rather than the full sequences, breaking them down into components, angular strokes, repeating clusters, forms that almost resembled known glyphs but didn't quite match anything I recognized. The results came back then, but not impossible. A few loose parallels, scattered references from different sites. Nothing conclusive, but nothing that ruled it out either. So I kept going, refining the search. Then I tried inputting the full sequence as it appeared on the walls. The repeated structure, the spacing, the way the symbols aligned vertically and interacted across columns. I ran the query, and the system immediately logged me out. No warning, no error. Just back to the login screen as if the session had never existed. I paused, logged back in, adjusted the input slightly, removed one element, tried again. Same result, instant log out. I sat there in the quiet terminal room, aware of how empty it was, the kind of silence that feels temporary, like it's waiting for people to return. There was a mug left behind on a shelf, a small crack above the window I'd noticed earlier, details that suddenly felt more real than the system in front of me. I tested again, different variations, different combinations, and every time I included the core pattern from the chamber, the system shut me out immediately. It didn't freeze or fail. It just refused to let me stay logged in long enough to get an answer. I could have called it a glitch, a corrupted dataset, something technical, and for a moment I tried to believe that, but I've been using that same system all week without a single issue, dozens of queries on unrelated data, and none of them triggered anything like this. Only those symbols did. I closed the terminal and went back to my room with the uneasy sense that I just asked a question I wasn't supposed to ask. The images were still on my phone, and I made sure not to connect them to anything local, but I still had access to Durham's remote archive through my university account. The system there was broader, independent, and far enough removed from the site that whatever was happening here shouldn't affect it. I selected the clearest images, uploaded them, flagged the submission as a standard identification request, and added a short note explaining the context without speculation. It was routine, something I'd done many times before. 2 hours later, my phone rang. I stepped outside before answering without really thinking about why. The number was from Durham, The woman on the line introduced herself as being from a university library. Her tone professional but slightly uncertain. She explained that the images I had uploaded had been automatically flagged by their system as restricted content, and that I needed to contact my department chair before proceeding any further. I asked what that meant, specifically, and she admitted she didn't know. The system had flagged it and passed the instruction along, nothing more. I thanked her and ended the call, then stood there looking out across the flat landscape, the mounds barely visible against the gray horizon. 2 hours, that was all it took, which meant the response wasn't manual. It wasn't someone reviewing the images. It was automatic, pre-configured, something already designed to recognize what I'd sent, something waiting for it. I didn't contact my department chair. Instead, I reached out to someone else entirely, a retired academic named Derek Woods, someone who had worked on pre-Neolithic systems decades earlier and who no longer had institutional ties to worry about. I found an old listing, sent him a concise message with a few images attached and a straightforward question, nothing speculative, just identification. His reply came that same evening. For sentences, no greeting, no analysis, just instructions: delete the images, don't go back. He couldn't explain why, and a final line asking me to understand that he wasn't being careless with a warning. I read it multiple times, and what stood out wasn't a warning itself. It was a tone. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't skeptical. It was certain, like he recognized exactly what he was seeing and knew the consequences of it. I tried to follow up the next morning by calling his institution, only to be told he had been hospitalized 2 days earlier after, suffering a stroke. The timing didn't line up cleanly, and that was what bothered me. Whether he'd seen the images before or after happened didn't change the fact that he'd responded quickly and then disappeared from reach. And suddenly Garrett came back to mind. The man I'd replaced, the one who had been there before me and left no trace behind. No notes, no belongings, nothing, just a name mentioned briefly and then forgotten. And now every attempt I made to understand what I found was closing off just as quickly. The site database, the university archive, Woods himself, all of it shutting down in ways that felt too fast, too precise to be coincidence. I didn't know what had happened to Garrett, but I was starting to think that whatever it was connected to the same thing I had just stepped into. And for the first time since arriving, I stopped focusing on the symbols and started focusing on him. Because if anyone had been here before me and seen what I'd seen, it was him. And if something had gone wrong, then his disappearance wasn't just background detail anymore. It was a warning I hadn't understood when I first heard it. I found his details buried in the staff system almost by accident, tucked into the usual places nobody ever thinks to clean up properly. Faculty listings, archive profiles, emergency contacts, and there it was, still active, untouched, as if whoever maintained it either didn't know it mattered or didn't realize it was gone in any meaningful way. The name led me to a contact in Bristol, a mobile number listed under a family connection, and I stared at it for longer than I expected before pressing call, because there isn't really a clean way to reach out to someone like that. No version of the conversation that doesn't sound intrusive when you strip it down to what you're actually doing, which is stepping into someone else's life, because you followed a trail they didn't finish. She answered after a few rings, and I introduced myself carefully, kept it professional, said I'd recently taken over his role at the site, and had come across some earlier work I believed was his, which wasn't. Entirely untrue, just not the full version. There was a pause on her end, not confusion, more like recognition of the direction the conversation was about to go. And when she spoke again, her voice had that measured tone people use when they've had to repeat difficult information enough times to know exactly how to say it without letting it linger. She told me he wasn't available, that he'd been placed in a private care facility in Oxfordshire weeks earlier. I asked what happened, even though I already suspected the answer wouldn't be simple, and she chose her words carefully, said he'd stopped making sense, not agitated, not distressed, just absent, as if whatever made him present in a room had quietly switched off. I asked what that meant in practice, what he actually did, and she said he spoke, but not in conversation, not with intent, just repeating the same pattern over and over, for short sounds, then silence, then again. She mentioned they had timed it, said it, repeated every 11 seconds with unsettling consistency. And that was a moment everything in my head aligned in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. I was sitting at my desk with my notebook open but untouched, pen in hand, and I set it down without writing a word. She kept talking after that about doctors and reports and the absence of any real explanation, and I responded where I had to, But my attention had already shifted because I knew something she didn't. I knew where that pattern came from. I knew what he had been exposed to before he ended up like that, but there was no point telling her, no version of that truth that would help. It would only pass the weight of it onto someone who couldn't use it. So I let the call in normally and stayed where I was, thinking about the pattern for beats, 11 seconds, the same interval I had heard below ground, the same structure repeating in two completely different places, and suddenly Garrett wasn't just a name mentioned in passing anymore. He was part of a sequence which had seen the images and responded with urgency before disappearing into a hospital bed. Garrett had been on site before me and was now repeating something he couldn't explain, and I was standing in the middle of the same path they had both taken. The realization didn't come all at once, but when it settled, it didn't leave any room for doubt. Every route I'd used to understand what I'd found had closed almost immediately. The site systems, the university archive, external contact, everything shutting down with a speed that didn't match normal bureaucracy, which meant it wasn't accidental. It was controlled, and that meant whatever I had was already considered something that needed to be contained. I started thinking about the data I had collected, the images, the notes, the recordings, all of it stored locally, vulnerable to being found or erased if the wrong person decided to look. And if that happened, then everything I had seen would disappear just as completely as Garrett's presence had. And the chamber would remain exactly where it was, undocumented and inaccessible. The longer I waited, the more likely that outcome became. And there was another factor I couldn't ignore, something less defined but more urgent. The sense that whatever existed in that fissure wasn't passive. It had been there for an incomprehensible amount of time, yes, but it wasn't inactive. It was operating on some kind of process, and I had no idea how long that process would remain in a state I could still observe. So I went back, not once but twice over the next few days, choosing times when the site was quiet, moving carefully, documenting everything I could reach, every wall surface, every sequence of markings, the platform, the fissure itself, the floor where the patterns extended beyond visibility. By the end of it, I had hundreds of images, taken from different angles, under different lighting, trying to capture as much variation as possible before something changed or I was stopped. And during those visits, I kept track of the rhythm. At first, it hadn't shifted, still the same 11-second interval. But on the final return, for days later, I measured again, and the timing was shorter, not by much, but enough to be undeniable. 9 seconds between sequences, repeated consistently. I checked it over and over to make sure it wasn't an error, but it held, which meant whatever was producing was accelerating, and that changed the situation completely because it wasn't just something ancient anymore, it was something progressing, and I was the only one recording it who wasn't actively trying to keep it hidden, or at least that's what I believed until the next time I went down. I had just entered the chamber and moved a few steps, and when I heard movement from the adjoining passage, footsteps, steady, deliberate, not cautious, not uncertain. Someone who knew the layout. I moved back against the wall and stayed completely still as Quinn appeared. She didn't hesitate or look around, didn't scan the space like someone exploring. She moved with purpose, straight towards specific sections as if she already knew exactly what was where. Her camera was fitted with equipment we didn't normally use, something specialized, and she began documenting the walls in precise order, not searching, just confirming. I watched her for several minutes, and there was no doubt she had been there before. Then she crossed into my chamber without pause, stepped over the informal boundary everyone else respected, went straight to the central structure, documented it quickly, then stood for a moment near the fissure, not photographing it, just observing, before leaving the same way she came. And I stayed where I was until the sound of her movement disappeared completely, because in that moment something clicked into place that hadn't fully made sense before. The rule she had announced in the first week about registering devices. I had written it down and ignored it, but now it was clear it had never been about safety or protocol. It was about tracking proximity, about knowing who was getting close to something that was already known, the delays, the interruptions, the redirected work. All of it suddenly aligned into a single pattern. This wasn't mismanagement or bureaucracy. It was deliberate interference. And Quinn wasn't just part of the team. She was part of the system controlling it, which meant the chamber wasn't new discovery at all. It was something already identified and managed long before I arrived. And Garrett hadn't been unlucky. He had crossed a line that already existed. I stayed down there for a while after she left, listening to the rhythm continue at its new pace. And when I came back up, I finally understood why everything I had tried so far had failed. Every digital route I used was visible, monitored, filtered before it could reach anyone outside. But there was one system on site that didn't operate the same way, one that existed for entirely different reasons. The satellite terminal in the field. Office. Something I had passed by every day without thinking twice. And for the first time I considered it not as background equipment, but as a way out. I sat in my room and thought it through, then began preparing the data, compressing files, organizing everything I had gathered, because if there was still a chance to get this out without it being intercepted, that was the only path left. The office itself was close, a short walk across open ground, and I waited until the middle of the night. Before moving, no light, no noise, just the cold air and a familiar route, the drive in my pocket, the information memorized rather than stored. I reached the door, entered the code I had observed earlier in the week, and stepped inside, already knowing that once I started this, there was no version of events where I could pretend I hadn't. Inside the field office, I didn't switch on the main light, just used a small desk lamp beside the terminal, the kind that only lights a tight circle of space and leaves everything else in shadow, and I plugged the drive in and opened the transfer interface, then just sat there for a moment staring at the screen without moving, because I want to be honest about what I was thinking at that point. Not the cleaned-up academic version where everything is rational and controlled, but the real one. I was thinking about Garrett sitting in a care facility in Oxfordshire repeating the same broken pattern every 9 seconds. I was thinking about Wood in a hospital bed in Bologna with no clear explanation for how he got there. I was thinking about the fact that every time I had gone back into that chamber, the pulse had changed, and always in one direction. I was thinking that every official route I had tried before, reporting it properly, trusting institutions, following procedure, had already been attempted by people more experienced than me and had ended in silence, removal, or collapse. And I was thinking that the only complete record of what I'd found was sitting in that USB drive. And if I left it behind or tried to go through normal channels again, it would disappear along with everything else. And eventually I would disappear too. That's not me being dramatic. That's just a pattern I could already see forming. So I sent it. I chose a few recipients carefully, not random. People I thought might actually read it instead of burying it. An independent journalist I had come across before, someone in academia who still asked uncomfortable questions, and a broader archaeology forum where things sometimes surface faster than institutions could suppress them. I attached everything, hundreds of images, audio, the pulse, partial interpretation notes, chamber coordinates, and a short explanation written in plain terms with no speculation, just what I had seen and measured, including the shift from 11 seconds down to 9. The upload took just under 7 minutes, and I watched every second of it, sitting still while the terminal hummed softly in that steady electronic rhythm that usually fades into background noise, but now felt loud enough to notice. When it finished, I just sat back for a moment and looked at the blank ceiling, then removed the drive and put it in my pocket like it had already become something else. I was halfway out of the office when I heard engines, 2 vehicles approaching fast from the direction of the Konya Road. No sirens, but no attempt at silence either, just speed, headlights sweeping across the outer edge of the site before I even reached the doorway. I stopped there instead of moving, because there wasn't anywhere to go that would change the outcome at that point. And within minutes they were there for men, not police, Ministry of Culture Security, the kind of presence you recognize immediately even if the insignia is different. One of them spoke enough English to tell me not to move, which I didn't need telling. Another went straight into the office while the other stayed with me. I could hear the terminal being used for less than a minute before he came back out and said something in Turkish, after which the English speaker just held out his hand. I gave him the drive without resistance. He looked at it briefly and sealed in the bag like it was routine procedure, which in hindsight is what unsettled me most, the familiarity of it. Like this wasn't new at all. Later that morning at 7:18, I learned that the article had already gone live. I know the exact time because I was in a small interview room when one of the officials' phones buzzed on the table, and I saw his expression change as he read it. Not shock, more like calculation, like he was already estimating how much damage control would be required. He left the room immediately and returned speaking rapidly on the phone in Turkish. The article itself had everything: the images, the audio breakdown, the pulse sequence, the location of Chamber 7 North, and the note about the interval shortening. I don't know how the journalist managed to process it that quickly, but she clearly understood what she had. because it went out fast, and just as fast a response came, the suppression order reached the newsroom before midday. I found out later directly from her. She managed a brief call before things escalated. Her editor had told her the order came straight from Ankara, that the piece had to be taken down, no discussion, no delay. And by the time I saw daylight through a small administrative window, the article was already gone, removed completely. And in the room with me, the atmosphere had shifted. The official who had been handling my statement came back in, and I could see immediately that something had changed. Not in me, in the situation, like a process had reached a control stage. He placed a printed form on the table and explained the charge in a flat voice. Unauthorized transmission of cultural heritage data from a protected UNESCO site, minimum 2-year legal process under Turkish law, and then slid the paper toward me. I signed it because there was no point refusing at that stage. Outside the window, the site looked exactly the same as it always had, flat, gray, motionless, but I could feel that something had already moved past containment. I stayed seated for a long time afterward, just watching the window because there was nothing else to do, and about an hour later the first vehicle arrived, white, unmarked, too clean for the environment it was driving through, which is what made it stand out immediately, followed by 2 more. And I realized quickly they weren't site vehicles. They were something else entirely, and the people who came out afterward from the northern access weren't wearing excavation gear, no helmets, no field equipment, just standard coveralls like they had been assigned to move objects rather than understand them. And that's exactly what they did. I couldn't see everything clearly from the window, but I saw enough to understand they were removing containers, sealed units, heavy enough that they required 2 people each to carry, moving steadily but without urgency, like this had been planned and rehearsed. I stopped counting after a while because it stopped feeling like observation and started feeling like participation, and all I could think about was the chamber itself. The platform, the grooves, the depth of time behind it, something older than anything above it by an order of magnitude that made language feel insufficient. And now it was being packed into transport cases and driven away under guard, or maybe not the chamber itself. Maybe only parts of it, maybe only what could be moved. I didn't know, I still don't, but what I didn't know is that the pulse had already changed before they arrived. It had dropped to 9 seconds on my last visit, and now I had no way of knowing whether it had stopped entirely or continued somewhere I couldn't reach. And for the first time since this began, I realized I wasn't just documenting something ancient anymore. I was watching something be actively controlled in real time, and I didn't know whether what they were doing was containment, extraction, or something far worse that I didn't yet have a word for. Garrett at first encountered the pulse at 11-second intervals, and after that he never really spoke the same way again. Woods had looked at the same material I had and ended up in a hospital ward within 2 days, and I had gone into that chamber multiple times, recorded everything I could, and still ended up sitting in a holding room facing a legal process that could stretch for years. And I remember sitting there wondering whether that meant I had been careful or just lucky or simply slower to break than the others. Because by late afternoon, the last of the containers had already been loaded. The teams moved with the same quiet efficiency they had shown before. No discussion, no hesitation, no sense that anything unusual had just been removed from beneath a UNESCO-protected excavation site. And then they left in a convoy heading north toward the main road. And within minutes, the dust settled, and the entire landscape looked exactly as it had before. Flat, empty, indifferent, as if nothing had ever been uncovered at all. The northern mound just sat there again like a natural rise in the ground. Something you would pass without a second thought. And that was the last time I ever saw Chamber 7 North in any physical sense. Later that day, the official returned with tea and placed it on the table without explanation, sitting across from me in silence while I drank it even though it was far too sweet. And as the light outside the small window faded into a dull gray eye, found myself thinking not about the arrest or the process ahead, but about the fact that I had already sent everything beyond the site before any of this happened. The archive, the photographs, the recordings, the translations, I had uploaded it to multiple places because by that point I already understood that containment was the real objective, not discovery. And suppression only works when information has a single place to be stopped, but once it spreads across networks with no central point of control, it stops being containable in any practical sense. And that is exactly what happened. The forum post moved first, then copies appeared in other places, then academic emails, then private shares between researchers. And and within hours of material was already outside the reach of any single institution. And I found out later that Fields had forwarded it to colleagues almost immediately after reading it, not because he understood what it meant, but because it was impossible to ignore, strange enough that it demanded to be passed on. And by the time any official response could even be coordinated, the archive already existed in multiple countries and systems that had nothing to do with archaeology or government control. And that realization stayed with me even as I was driven away that evening, sitting in the back of a ministry vehicle, watching the site disappear into the distance until the mounds became just two faint shapes against a flat horizon, and then nothing at all. And what I understand now, looking back on it from a distance that feels almost unreal, is that the physical site was never the end point. It was just the entry point, because the archive is still out there, still circulating, still being translated and debated and dismissed and reinterpreted by people who will never meet each other, and there is no final version of it anymore, no single authority that can pull it back. And the ministry never acknowledged what was actually in Chamber 7 North beyond. Legal language about unauthorized transmission and site protection. They never named the chamber, never addressed the symbols, never mentioned the vehicles or containers or what was taken from beneath the mound that afternoon. And Garrett is still in care in Oxfordshire, as far as I know. Patricia still sends occasional updates to a small circle of people, and the description never changes. He is stable, he is calm, but he continues to repeat the same 4-sound pattern every 11 seconds, without variation. And I still find myself thinking about that interval, 11 seconds, then 9, and what it means that it changed while I was watching it, and whether there's a point where it keeps dropping until something else begins. And I think about the fact that whatever left that chamber in those sealed containers is now somewhere I will never be allowed to see, and whatever remains below the bedrock is still there, still active, still doing whatever it was doing before we ever arrived. And the only thing I can say with certainty is that the archive didn't end with us. It continued without permission, and now it exists in places no one can fully control anymore. And that part, at least, is still true.